Hey class, in this video we're going to be using Godot for the first time. We're going to be adding our character animations into the Godot editor and setting up a little scene and just a bit of code to make the animations work and move the character around. So mostly the focus is going to be on animating using Godot and the character designs that we created. But we'll go over a few of the basics as well. I'll link to some other tutorials and things like that to go over the interface and to kind of get you familiar with Godot. So we'll be focusing mainly on the animation. It's a little bit detailed, so it can be kind of tricky. So, take your time with figuring everything out, and feel free to pause the video and, ask me questions. We can troubleshoot stuff together. So anyway, let's go ahead and get started. So you are going to have to download a couple of things to get started here. So one of those things is the Godot engine. Obviously, I'll put a link in the YouTube description to download that. You can also find it on the Blackboard software page. But the other thing you'll have to download is a little template project that I've created to help you get started. So if you're on the Open Lab page, you can go to the lectures section, scroll down to the notes on setting, and then you can see the button here that says Download Lab Archive. So this is going to be the lab for today. If you click on that, it's going to download a little folder to your downloads folder. Okay, so you may want to go ahead and put that on your desktop or wherever it is on your computer that you have your art and stuff like that. So I'm going to create a new folder just for all of my MMP 270 stuff. So I'm just going to call this MMP 270. And I'm going to go ahead and put lab 1 in there. So for me, the Mac system automatically extracted the zip file. If you're on Windows, it's not going to do that, or maybe on your Mac it didn't do that. Just make sure to extract the zip file so you can see the files here. You can see there's a few files that kind of come default with Godot, and then a player script that I wrote. So if you have any trouble unzipping the file, just let me know. Once you've unzipped it, you can delete it, so we can get rid of that. And then let's go to the desktop and then go to that lab. And the only thing that you're going to need to add to this is your own artwork. So you can make a new folder for your sprites. And you could have just dragged this sprites folder in here, but I actually have some stuff in here that I don't want. So just to keep my project, not too large, I'm just going to drag in these sprite sheets that I exported last week. So if you had any trouble exporting sprite sheets for the character design assignment, let me know. We can go over that as well. So you just need your sprite animations. You need the idle animation, jump animation, and walk animation. And they do need to be in the sprite sheet format. And they don't really have to be PNGs, but that's how they export from Pascal. So if they're another file format, that's probably okay. Anyway, so that's what we need to do to have everything ready to get started with Godot. So now I'm going to go ahead and open up Godot. I'm just going to type into the spotlight and hit open. So just open it however you would open it on your machine. And we're going to have to import this project. So we got to make sure to do that correctly. So what we want to do is just find this lab project on our computer and import those files. So you can click the import button. You probably won't see any files here if you've just opened Godot for the first time. It may ask you to open up like a demo project or something like that. Just say cancel and just get to the projects page and then click import. So it's going to ask for an existing project. You can click browse and then just find wherever this is on your computer. So there's lab 1, and what you have to do is select the project.godot file. That's the main project file, and just click open and then import and edit. And so what you're going to see is this kind of like default scene that I created for you to add your character design into. You'll see this kind of like main scene here. If you click on the zoom, it'll zoom into 100% zoom. And basically what I did is I just set up some boundaries. So I set up like a ground, which is actually invisible. I just like put a collider here. We're going to add art for that later. I put a wall here and on the left and right just to kind of keep our character inside the boundaries. That's not really something that we'll probably be doing all the time, but just for this example. And then you have a player file or a player scene as well. So this is your main scene. All of the different assets in Godot are usually organized into different scenes that have nodes in them. So you always have this kind of hierarchical system. You can see I have like my main scene over here. And then I have a couple nodes. I have my boundaries and my player. And inside the boundaries, I also have nodes that have these things called collision shapes, which are basically letting the physics engine detect collisions between different objects in the scene. And then I have my player, which is its own like mini scene. So one of the things that's fun about Godot is you have all these like little mini scenes that kind of fit inside of each other. So I can edit the player outside of the main scene and then put it into the main scene. That makes it easy to make really complicated scenes. So again, I'm not going to go over everything about the interface since there's plenty of tutorials to cover that on YouTube and other places. Excuse me. I'm just going to go ahead and go over how to add your animations in. So you should see your sprites folder with your animations here, and we need to add that into our player file. And I'm kind of going to go over that like bit by bit. Just to kind of streamline that process. But if you have any questions in the process, we can go over them. So this right here, this little blue guy is our player. And so when I open that player scene up, you're going to see that it's basically just this little shape. And whenever you see those little blue shapes, those are colliders. So that basically the game engine can use those to decide if two things are touching each other. And what the game engine does is it uses these kind of like simple shapes, so it doesn't have to do as much math and calculation to do all the physics so that it can run fast enough for us to play. And you can actually change the collision shape here. So over in the inspector menu over here, you can see if we look at these different shapes that are available, there's a capsule, which is what I'm using. There's also just a regular circle. There's more complex shapes that you can design. And then there's also just a regular rectangle. So if you have like a circle character, you might want to change to a circle shape. If you have a more rectangular character, you might want to change to a rectangle. And you can edit the shape to fit your art. So usually there's a couple pivot points and you can kind of move the shape around. Another thing is you can see the middle of the shape. For me, it's kind of like offset a little bit. You actually want to make sure that that is right in the middle of your scene. And the way that you can do that, we're going to be doing this with a few things, is under the node 2D menu. So let's collapse a couple of these menus. You can go to transform and you can see this position right here. So that's the position within the scene. So that's a little tricky because it's not the position in the whole game, it's the position inside of the scene. So we want to reset that to 0, 0. So that looks pretty good. So we can get started adding our art. So I'm just going to drag my animations into the player scene. And I want to make sure that they're a child of the player, not the collision shape. So when I dragged it in, it actually, you can see here that it ended up being part of the collision. And I just want to make sure that it's just part of the player, not the collision. Then I want to rename this. So if I click on this and hit enter, I can then name this idle. So I want to use kind of the same naming conventions for these so that they look the same everywhere. So the next thing I'm going to do is go to my transform and reset the position and the scale. It was kind of scaled weirdly when I put it inside the collision shape because the collision shape is scaled, and so its child took on that scale. So you want to make sure that the scale is just 1 and the position is 0, 0. So when you drag and drop, sometimes you can get like weird things like that. So it's good to go into the transform and just make sure to reset those settings. The next thing is that you can see we have all 4 of our sprite animation parts on the screen at the same time. Obviously, that's not what we want. The way that we change that is going to the animation menu over here. And then we can see V frames as vertical frames and H frames as horizontal frames. So if I tell it how many frames there are, there's 2 vertical frames and 2 horizontal frames, then it does a better job of understanding where the art is. And so that looks better. So that's my idle state. If I want at this point, I can adjust my collider to match the art a little bit better. And to make that easier, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the idle and I'm going to lock it and make it so that I can't click on it. So when I click the screen, I actually can't click the art. I can only click on my little collision shape. And so I'm going to drag this a little bit smaller. And I'm just going to try to line it up with his feet and the top of his head. So that way we want to make sure that the art, really looks like it's colliding with the rest of our scene. Obviously, I didn't actually put any, the rest of our scene is kind of invisible, so it's not as big of a deal here, but that's going to be important for the future. So we can save that. And then I'm actually going to lock the collision shape into place as well, so I don't actually accidentally move that. So I really use the lock and this toggle selection a lot so that I'm not just like constantly accidentally clicking on stuff that I don't mean to. Okay, so we've got our idle animation. Let's put our other 2 sprites in before we start our animation. So another way that I can add something to the scene is I can click on the main node or any other node in the scene and then go to add child node. And then you can look through all the nodes, but I know what I'm looking for, so I'm just going to type it in here. I'm going to type sprite. You might think I want an animated sprite, but we're actually using the animation player to animate our sprite. So I'm just going to click sprite and then create. And then this sprite doesn't have my art. So what I need to do now is go find a texture and click load, go to my sprites. And so this one is going to be my walk. So I'm going to click walk and click open. And now we see the walk on the screen. So now I don't really have to reset the transform because I didn't drag and drop. It didn't like try to set the position or anything like that. So I can ignore that for now. And I just have to go and set my frames in the animation. So there's 2 vertical frames and 2 horizontal frames. And you can see since I used the same art from my original Piskel drawing, that overlaps very nicely. If you see that that's not overlapping or that like there's, a lot of like differences between the 2 animations, that's going to create some issues later on. So you might want to try to resolve that. If you can't figure that out, let me know and we can take a look at it. So that's locked in place. That looks good. I'm going to go ahead and lock that up. And then I'm going to drag and drop my last animation. That's my jump animation. And so let's see, I can get the player now. And I want to change this to jump. Oh, I forgot to change this sprite name to walk. That's actually the most important one. That has to be called walk or you're going to get some errors in the code that we're going to look at in a second. So make sure to call that walk and also use the capital W. I'll explain that in a little bit. So let's finish working our jump animation. So our transform is a little bit off because I did the drag and drop. So I'm going to reset that to 0, 0. And then I'm going to go to my animation. And this one has actually 3 vertical frames. So I have to go up to 3 and 2. And it also overlaps so that everything looks good. If you're having some issues with overlapping, let me know. We can take a look. So now we're ready to actually do our animation. So let's lock this guy up as well. So let's go to our animation player. You should see when you click on this drop down here, let's drag this up a little bit. When you click on the idle here, you should see idle, jump, and walk, and they should match these images or sprites over here. Those are things that I wrote into the example, so they should already be there. If they're not, what you can do is go to animation and click new, and then it'll let you name the animation and you can create a new one there. So let's go over the basics of animation. So if you've taken any animation classes at BMCC, you've probably worked with keyframes, and that's kind of the basis of the animation that we're going to be doing here. So we can keyframe a lot of different things about the animation, and we're just going to be looking at a couple of them. And so let's start with our idle animation. And so one of the things, since we have these 3 different sprites, one of the tricky things that we have to do is when we switch to a different state, when we're walking or jumping or just standing there idle, we need to make sure to turn off the other state. So that's a little bit tricky, but basically when we're idle, we want to be able to see the idle, but we want to turn off walk and jump. So one way of doing that is just to keyframe that default. So I can keyframe all of those states by clicking add track, property track, and click on idle. And then I can search for it, but I know that this is called visibilities or visible. So I'm just going to click visible. So we want the idle animation to be visible. So I'm going to click here and click insert keyframe. And it's going to insert a keyframe of whatever the current value is. So you can see that the eye is visible. So that means it's going to be visible. But I also want to keyframe in the walk and the jump. So I'm going to add another track and do walk, do visible, click. I'm actually doing right click here and doing insert keyframe. And so you can see here, they're kind of small, but this check mark is on, this one's off. And that's because that's the current state here. So if you accidentally, had this as on, that's really easy. All you have to do is turn it off and then insert a new keyframe on top. And you can drag the keyframes around. So now I have a whole bunch of keyframes that are on top of each other. I don't want that. So let's just delete a couple of them. And then this one we can just leave right there. Or I actually made a whole bunch of them. Okay, so there's just one. That's good. That's what we want. And so we'll just leave that there. Okay, one more for the jump. And this is where it starts to get a little tedious because we are going to kind of be doing repetitive stuff, but that's just kind of how animation goes. So let's insert a keyframe there. And so now we're ready to actually do our animation. So the way that we actually animate our sprite sheets is by changing the number of the frame that we're on. So we're going to add one more track. This is for the idle animation, the one we're actually working on. And this, I'm going to type in frame. And so here we can see frame. And the thing here at the beginning that says int, that stands for integer. So it's just like a number, like 1, 2, 3, or 4. And you can see when we click on our idle, the frame value is over here and it's at 0. And there's a little keyframe right there next to it. And so if we want to add that into our animation, we just hit the keyframe. And we can see it's a little bit tricky. I'm going to actually zoom in a little bit here so we can see our frames a bit better. Okay, so we can now see that the first frame is right in there. It's kind of small, and it's actually automatically gone to the second frame for us. So that's kind of nice. It knows that we're going to be kind of going from frame to frame. But I actually don't want to go immediately to the wave. So we're going to figure out how to do that in a second. So what I can do is just click another keyframe and it just adds it in there for me. So let's zoom in on this a little bit. Oh, these guys are actually a little bit over here. Okay. So we have, let's zoom back down. Okay, that looks good. So we have our first 2 frames, and then we can increment the frame and click another keyframe, and then it did it for us again. It didn't do it for us the first time because that second time because I moved away for a second. And then the third one is our last keyframe. You can see we have our 4 frames here. So if we go back and play through it, that's our whole animation. So one thing that we want to do is adjust the length of the animation to right here. So 0.4, that's 0.4 seconds. Okay, so that's not very long. And then we also want to click on this loop button because, you know, it's not a very long animation, so we want it to loop. So he's waving for a while. That looks good. But we also want to have the time that he's not waving extended a little bit. So what we can do is just drag these guys over. So we can decide, you know, however long we want him to be just standing there before he waves, we can create that space. So we'll wait 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then we'll wave, and then it'll loop back to the beginning. So you can play around with where the keyframes are to change the timing. It doesn't have to just go one after the other. And you might think like, okay, this wave happens a little too fast. So let's actually make that happen a little bit slower. And so I'll actually have a full second long animation. And it kind of cuts off at the end here. So let's actually do 1.1, or I could drag them back a bit so that it's a little bit more even. Okay, so that's pretty good for my idle animation. And so we're gonna kind of repeat that process with our walk and our jump. So I'm gonna go over to walk, and then I'm gonna change to the walk animation here. So again, I have to add the visibility. So I'm gonna turn off the idle, turn on the walk, and then go ahead and add visibility for each one of my sprites. And I'm just going to kind of run through this because it's a little tedious. So make sure I get each one of my sprites, and then the sprites that are not visible will not be visible. The sprite that I want visible, which is walk, will be visible. So just set it up here first and then just go straight through the keyframes. Okay, so now we're ready to animate our frames. So I'm gonna grab the walk sprite and I'm gonna type in frame to animate that frame. And I'm gonna keyframe 0. And then, you know, now that I know this process, basically I just hit the keyframe button 4 times. I know there's 4 sprites and I'm pretty much done. And remember to hit loop, and then let's shorten this to 0.4, and then we can take a look. So that's pretty fast. So let's actually double this length. So I'm gonna make this 0.8, and I'm just gonna drag each one of these guys over a bit. So that looks pretty good. And so I think that's all I need for the walk. So that was a little bit faster. Now we're getting used to it. So let's move on to our jump animation. And we'll go back to the beginning. And so this is basically the same thing. Turn off walk, turn on jump. Add our 3 sprite tracks. So add the visibility for each one. And then just keyframe each one as long as you have them set up the way you want first. So the jump is on, the other 2 are off. That looks good. So then let's click on the jump and let's go to our animation and let's keyframe the first frame. And here I actually hadn't added the property yet. So some of the properties have the frames built in, so we can just hit create and then we can just jump ahead. So I think there's 6 total. Let's see. I think I might have, yeah, I started a little too early on that one. So let's keyframe that at 0. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay. And so let's set this to 0.6, set it to loop and play. So that's pretty good. Let's actually set it to 0.8. And I'm just gonna make 2 of the frames a little bit longer. So I'm gonna drag this guy to the end, drag this guy over 1. There we go. So I think that'll be pretty good. So there's this moment where he's kind of hanging out in the air. So you can play around with that till you get the animation that you like. You know, just move things around, change the timing, however you think it will work. And so now at this point, you should actually be good to go. I'm gonna try building the project. So I actually hit Command B, but you can also just hit the play button up here. And let's see, so that works, and the jump works as well. So we're gonna take a look at a couple things in the script first before we're done, but your project should be working at this point. So that's pretty cool. There is a little weird glitch with the fact that the ground is just like this one thing. That's something that we're gonna fix pretty soon when we work on our setting, but as long as your player kind of shows up, he does his idle thing, he does his jump thing, don't worry too much about some glitches. Godot is actually pretty glitchy, as we'll find out throughout the semester, but that's okay. We'll go over different ways to deal with that. So I'm gonna close this out, and I'm just gonna give you guys a quick look at the script this works with. So I'm gonna click on the player and then click on the script. So this is something that should already be there. You don't have to write this, but I just want to show you guys what is happening here. And then, you know, you guys can kind of play with stuff on your own. So the first thing that happens is it says extends kinematic body 2D. And that's actually the type of node that the player is. And what that means essentially is like kinematics is a term for a style of physics where we measure like velocity and force and things like that. And kinematics in programming is like a way of recreating those things in a digital setting. So to have a kinematic body has some like built-in qualities that allow us to, you know, apply forces to the player. So then we have a few values here. And notice the word export at the beginning of each one of these lines. So export, what that means is that it actually shows us in the property window those values. So you can see over here the speed, the jump force, and the gravity. And we can also actually reset those back to their original values. And look what happens when I reset those. Suddenly I have a different values. So now my player is walking much slower, and he really can't jump very high at all. So what I did when I was playing with it is I just changed those values. I said I wanted to walk a bit faster and I wanted to jump like a lot higher. And so I can actually change these values in the editor. So that's what the export word does there. It means that I can change these numbers while I'm editing my game instead of having to go into the code. And so that's a nice feature, because what that means is I can write some scripts or find scripts for you guys to use, or you guys can find scripts in the asset library as well. And then if there's some variables over here, you can play with those to see how it changes the game. So for those variables, I have the speed of the player, how fast he moves back and forth, the jump force, how high the player jumps or how much power is put into the jump, and then the gravity. So that's like how much gravity is in the world, how fast things fall towards the ground. Then I have a velocity variable for the player. I'll go into this math a little bit later, but that's just basically keeping track of how fast the player is going. Then I have an animation player. There's another special term here, on ready. That basically means that this is something that's in the scene. So you can see the animation player references this object in the scene. And so if I want the script to wait until the scene is loaded before it starts using it, I can use the onReady variable to avoid like some errors. Another thing you can see here is this $ animation player. That's essentially saying look for something called animation player in my project hierarchy. You can see I have the same thing with the walk, and I'll explain why I have that in a little bit. So the animation player is used to trigger all the different animations. So then I only have one main function here, which is this physics process function. And that essentially is hooking into the game engine's physics function, which processes all the different things that are happening in the scene as far as like what should be moving where, if things are colliding, all that different stuff. And there's also this variable that we get with that called delta. And delta is just how much time has passed since the last time we did this process. So things move at a constant pace, and we have to know how far to move them as we go through the game. So then there's a few things in here. So we start with a 0 velocity, and then we capture the input. And that's another setting that you have to build. It should come with the project settings, so you shouldn't have to worry about this, but I'll show you where it is because you can change those settings. So if you go to project and project settings, this is under the input map. And I'm going to collapse all this stuff because it's kind of at the bottom. A lot of stuff in here, but basically I actually created these three: move left, move right, and jump, and I map them to different keys. And so if you want to change the key here, you can actually click on the edit, and then you can press whatever key you want. So I'm using the arrow keys, but if you wanted to use like move left is A, you can hit A and then hit OK. One thing that's a little tricky here is if I hit A and then hit enter, you can see it actually changes to enter, and that's not what I wanted. I wanted A. I actually am using left for the move left, so that's what I had in there. Then for move right, I have the right key, but you could change that to D or anything that you wanted. And then finally for the jump, I was using the up key, but you could use, you know, Z or X or space, whatever you want to use, just type it in there and that's what it'll be. So you can actually change these values and add buttons, and the reason they have this is because it adds an easier way to support different formats, like if you're playing with a keyboard and mouse versus playing with a gamepad or something else. So that's another thing that we have to be aware of. So then I'm asking if the move left key is pressed, then add some speed to the velocity, but actually subtract the speed because we're going in the left direction. And then if we're doing the action move right, then we add speed to the character. And I'll go over more of the physics stuff in later lessons. So then we're using a special Godot function called move and slide, which kind of adds a little bit of like sliding to the movement instead of just kind of like going at a consistent pace. And then we apply gravity to the player. So we're taking the Y velocity. Y is kind of like going down, and we're adding gravity times delta, times how much time has passed. So we want to kind of like map everything to delta to the change in time. Finally, if we press jump, but we also have this special function is on the floor, and that's the one that actually has a little bit of a glitch, but we'll fix that in a later example. If we're on the floor, we want to be able to jump, right? So if we're on the floor and we press jump, then we apply the jump force. And the jump force is negative because, again, Y is going down, so the jump force has to go back up. And then, so that's all of our physics. Then we update the animation. So if we're not on the floor, that means we're in the sky. So we do a jump. There's more complex ways to do this, but this is a really simple way to start. Elif means, so if we're not on the floor, okay, so if we are on the floor, we'll ignore this part, and then we have elif. And what elif means is like, so we're not on the floor, but we might want to check some other condition, and that condition is whether or not our velocity is 0. So that means we're standing still. So if our velocity is not 0, then we want to use the walk animation. It's a little complicated. We'll go over this stuff more. And then finally, the last else statement is saying we're playing the idle animation. So if nothing's happening, we're not falling, we're not jumping, and we're not walking, then we play the idle animation. And then the last little thing here is why we really need to make sure this one sprite is called walk. Basically, if we're walking to the left, we want to flip our sprites to the left. And if we're walking to the right, we want to flip our sprites to the right. You do have the option to make different animations for those, but it's a lot easier to just kind of flip the animation we already have. So that's what this last little bit of code is doing. And that's pretty much everything. So, you should be able to play this little, game, if you want to call it that. It's not really much of a game. But you should be able to see your character jumping around, and you should be able to see your animations working. So if you're having any issues with any of that, just let me know and we can take a look. And that's pretty much all we have to do for the lab this week. So I'm going to save this, and I think that's it. Do I have to go over anything else? No, that's pretty much it. You should take a look at these other links on here. Just a quick overview of the Godot game engine, tutorial series on the basics, which covers a lot of stuff. Like, you probably won't want to watch all of this right now because there's a ton of stuff here, but maybe take a look through here as we go through new ideas. You can come back here and say, oh, I know what transforms are now, so I'm going to watch this video. And then the last one is this Learn Godot game engine in 50 minutes. This is the one that most of the ideas that I used in this video are kind of based on that, and then just the regular Godot documentation, which I should include a link to, although it's probably not going to be easy to understand at this point. But you can just look up the Godot documentation. It has all the code and all the different things that you can do on there. So yeah, that's it for this video, and I'll see you guys in class.